So let's talk about Uruguay. It's this tiny country, right? And it's wedged between two of the most historically chaotic giants in South America, Brazil and Argentina. And yet, it's this little pocket of calm in a sea of volatility. For decades, people have been looking at it and just asking one simple question. How? How do they pull it off?
To really get what makes Uruguay so different, you have to go back to December 2001. Over in Buenos Aires, it's absolute chaos. The economy has collapsed. People are literally taking hammers to the banks to try and get their life savings. The country burned through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. Now you take a 50-kilometer ferry ride across the river to Montevideo, and it's quiet. The banks are open. People are just calmly sipping mate. It feels like you've landed on another planet.
And that is the central mystery, right? How can two places so close you can see one from the other be so fundamentally different? Is it just dumb luck, or is there something else going on, something by design?
Well, as it turns out, Uruguay's legendary stability isn't an accident at all. It's actually a design feature, and it was coded into the country from the moment it was created. This wasn't a nation born from some glorious revolution or conquest. Nope, this was a nation born from a spreadsheet.
The key concept you got to understand here is the buffer state. Back in the 1820s, Brazil and Argentina were constantly at war over this chunk of land. And the British Empire, who just wanted their ships to sail to peacefully and trade, got fed up. So a British diplomat basically stepped in and said, all right, you two are going to create a neutral zone between you to stop the fighting, a geopolitical airbag. And that airbag?
See, that origin story baked a very specific survival instinct into the country's DNA. I mean, think about it. You're a tiny nation of 3.4 million people living next to these absolute giants. You can't survive with a powerful army. You survive with one thing and one thing only, your reputation. So you become obsessed, absolutely obsessed with rules, with international law, with honoring contracts, because that's the only thing that guarantees the giants won't just step on you.
And you can see the results today. I mean, just look at these numbers. It's insane. Uruguay isn't just a little bit better than its neighbors. It's playing a completely different game. On corruption, it scores a 73 out of 100. Brazil and Argentina, they're down in the 30s. It's ranked #1 for rule of law in all of Latin America. This isn't an accident. This is an evolutionary adaptation.
But that obsession with rules and stability led to something else. It led to the creation of one of the world's very first and most expensive welfare states, long before that was cool. And this system, it's the engine of the country's social peace.
Get this, in the early 1900s, while workers in London and New York were basically still living in a Charles Dickens novel, Uruguay was already rolling out an 8-hour workday. They legalized divorce for women. They established free, secular education for every single child. They essentially speed-ran all of 20th century social progress before most countries had even started the race.
So, the big question is, how on earth did they pay for it all? Well, not by just printing money like their neighbors. They did it with taxes, crushing, relentless taxes. Their standard value-added tax, kind of like a sales tax, is a whopping 22%. That's higher than the average in the European Union. This level of stability, it does not come cheap.
But here's the flip side. Here's what all that tax money actually buys you: social peace. Over 60% of Uruguayans are considered middle class. That's the largest proportion in all of the Americas. And extreme poverty, it's basically a statistical error. See, when you have a massive, comfortable middle class, your politics becomes moderate. People aren't calling for a revolution. They just want to make sure their pension gets paid on time.
Okay, so a strong welfare state is great, but that's not enough to survive the madness of the 21st century. So, Uruguay did what it does best. It turned to pragmatic, innovative, and let's be honest, kind of boring solutions for very modern problems.
First up, energy. The speed of their green transition is just mind-blowing. In less than 10 years, Uruguay went from being totally dependent on imported oil to generating 98% of its electricity from renewables. How'd they do it? Simple. They offered private companies ironclad 20-year contracts to build wind farms. So now, when global oil prices go crazy, Uruguay barely even notices. Their fuel is the wind. And well, the wind is free.
And then, of course, there's the famous cannabis legalization. Now, this wasn't some kind of libertarian dream. No. This was a cold, calculated security move. The government looked at the bloody, failing war on drugs and said, this is stupid. So they decided to fight the drug cartels not with bullets, but with paperwork. And just look at how they did it. It's brilliantly boring.
To buy weed legally, you have to register with the government, go to an approved pharmacy, scan your thumbprint to make sure you're you, and then you can buy your state-regulated monthly quota. They took a market that fuels violence across the entire globe and turned it into the most uncool, administrative, bureaucratic procedure you could possibly imagine.
But here's where the story gets complicated. If you dig just a little bit beneath all this calm, predictable surface, you find some really disturbing, contradictory truths. This stability, it has a dark side.
And here's the biggest one. Uruguay is dying of old age. The country's fertility rate has cratered to just 1.27 children per woman. You need 2.1 just to keep the population stable. This is a demographic time bomb. The pyramid that supports their amazing welfare state is flipping upside down, with fewer and fewer young workers left to pay for a booming number of retirees. Eventually, that math just stops working.
But here's the classic Uruguayan twist. In 2023, they faced this existential crisis head-on. The government had to raise the retirement age. In France, this led to massive riots. In Uruguay, yeah, people protested, politicians complained, but in the end, they just debated it in Congress and they passed the law. The dull, beautiful machinery of democracy just worked.
Okay, prepare for some serious whiplash here. For all its reputation for being safe, Uruguay's homicide rate is about 11.2 per 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, that is nearly double the murder rate of the United States. So how on earth can the Switzerland of South America be so violent?
The answer is the port. The same efficiency and rule of law that makes it a great place to ship soybeans also makes it a perfect logistics hub for, cocaine headed to Europe. The violence is almost entirely contained within the criminal underworld, with gangs fighting over these shipping routes. The key is that, so far, this violence hasn't really corrupted the state. The institutions have been strong enough to keep it walled off. For now.
And all of this brings us to the central tension of modern Uruguay. They've built this incredible fortress of stability, but that fortress is incredibly expensive to maintain. And you have to start wondering, can it actually survive its own success?
Their big bet is to pivot their economy. Realizing they can't compete on making stuff, they launched a national strategy to become a Silicon Ranch, exporting intelligence instead of cows. They were one of the first countries to give every single public school kid a laptop, and now that generation is fueling a tech boom. And it's created this fascinating dual economy. You have a high-tax welfare state for the regular citizens, living right alongside these 0% tax-free zones for tech companies. It's a pragmatic hack for sure, but how long can that last?
Because for the average person living there, the cost of living, what they call the costo país, the cost of the country, is brutal. Gas is the most expensive in the Americas. A basic Toyota Corolla can cost you $45,000. Even a Big Mac is consistently the priciest in Latin America. All of these taxes and tariffs protect some local jobs, sure, but they punish consumers and put a real ceiling on growth.
So what's the next big gamble? Green hydrogen. The plan is to use all that extra wind power to create clean, synthetic fuels to sell to Europe. It's a multi-billion-dollar bet that could turn them into a green energy superpower, the Saudi Arabia of wind. But, and this is a huge but, it requires insane amounts of fresh water, which is a resource the country has been struggling with during historic droughts. It's a high-risk, high-reward play.
So it all comes back to this. Uruguay made a choice a long time ago. They chose rules over revolution. They chose contracts over charisma. They chose boring over exciting. And as you look around at a world that seems to be spinning more and more out of control, you really have to wonder, is that kind of stability, with all of its incredible costs and contradictions, the smartest survival strategy there is? In the 21st century, is being boring the ultimate superpower?